So how can we update our ingredients here in the ingredients component when our delete request is done? Well, again, we can use a hook we already learned about, useEffect. Remember that useEffect runs after every render cycle. So useHTTP sends a request, and in that request, in the end, we dispatch response if we succeed. This updates the state, and therefore it will re-trigger the component that uses our hook to rebuild itself. So our component, ingredients component, will rebuild itself when send request is done, thanks to the logic we have in our hook, because dispatch HTTP, which is coming from user reducer, updates the state. This rebuilds the component in which it is used. It's of course used in our hook, but that hook is used in this component, therefore this component rebuilds. By the way, if we would use the same hook in a different component, that other component would not rebuild, because as I said, the logic is copied for every component. They're not sharing the same data. So if you're sending a request in component A, that does not mean that component B also sends or anything like that. You're just sharing in the sense of copying the same logic across components. Here, however, we know that this component will rebuild whenever the request response is there. Hence, we can actually turn this useEffect call here into a more useful one. We can listen, for example, to the data, because we know that on our custom request here, when a response is there, we update response data, and that means that we set data here on our state. So our data changes when our response is there. Now for a delete request, we get no data, but still we'll change something here. We'll set a new value in response data, and that alone should suffice here. So in ingredients.js, we're listening to data, because in this useEffect call here, when we have new data, then I want to call dispatch, which is now coming from my ingredient reducer here, dispatch type delete, because we deleted a component in the end here, and pass the ID. Problem is, where do I get that ID from? I need the ID here on the action I'm creating, but this useEffect call knows nothing about the ID. Well, solution again could be that we add a feature to our hook here, to our custom hook. In the custom hook, we can add another field like a request extra, which initially also is null. Now that extra can be set when the request is sent. There we can set extra to action extra, let's say. So I expect to have an extra field on the incoming action. We're dispatching the send request here, and there we can send set an extra, and I expect to get this from outside. So as an extra argument in the send request function, I get my request extra, and I'm storing this in my state here. So back to our ingredients component, when we call send request here, I send no body, so I pass null here, but for request extra, I forward the ingredient ID. So now this ingredient ID gets added to send request. In the hook where we define this function, we then store it in the state, which is the state for this component, right? And therefore, we can now also return that request extra here in the data by getting it from our HTTP state extra. And that means that in the ingredients component, there we can also extract request extra from the result of use HTTP and now use that here in useEffect, so that the ID I need to provide for the delete action here actually is my request extra, because we know that we'll store our ID in request extra when we send that delete request. Once the delete request is done, once the response is there, data will be emitted. Hence, this effect will run, and then we can dispatch this delete action, which adjusts our ingredients. So here, let's add request extra, and this should work. Now let me also step in here for a second and make it really clear that it can be strange to think about HTTP requests like this at first, that we're sending them somewhere and we're handling the response somewhere else in useEffect here. Nonetheless, this really embraces the concept of hooks after all, and whilst it can be strange to look at a HTTP request like this initially, it actually makes handling it much more elegant in the long run, I believe. because you can clearly see in your code where you're handling results of your request, where you're changing your data, and where you're just dispatching that request, where you're sending it off, so to say, with send request. Nonetheless, and I want to emphasize this here, an alternative would have been that the send request function we're returning in our use HTTP hook, that this send request function, for example, returns the normal promise the fetch method, the fetch API, always gives us. So that in the places where we call send request, we can add a then and a catch block, and then simply still do our logic in these then and catch blocks instead of using useEffect. This approach here of splitting the sending of the request and the handling of the response can be more confusing initially, because now you have to care about getting things like that request extra from the I send my request place to the I handle the response place, which is our effect here. Nonetheless, in the long run, as I said, I think it leads you to write cleaner code where you split your responsibilities and where you just have to switch the way you think about it, and then you'll actually have no problems with that approach. Just be aware that if you're not liking this approach at all, you could return a promise in your HTTP hook inside of send request there, and then simply chain all your response handling logic after send request in this component, in this ingredients component. You could do that, but using this approach here with useEffect handling the response simply is the approach where you really embrace hooks and use them to their fullest potential. Now I ran out of ingredients, so in order to test this, let's first fix the add ingredient handler now. In add ingredient handler, thus far we're also dispatching a send request and so on. Instead now we call send request, which again is this function coming from our custom hook here. So we call send request. The URL is of course the same URL we used down there, so I'll just copy that. The method here, since we add ingredient, will be post. The body will be that body we had before, needs to be JSON, so let's use JSON stringify. And here I need no special extra, so I won't pass that. So this again calls send request, and just as before, this goes to our hook, executes this function, emits this event, and once the response is there, emits this response event where it stores the response data. So now again, we can use our effect to react to that data in the ingredients.js file and update our local ingredients based on that data we got back. So here we have useEffect, which reruns when the data changes or when the request extra changes. And we then always dispatch a delete request. Now that's probably not what we want here. Well, in the end, we can find out what should be dispatched. We know that if we have a request extra in our application here, we want to dispatch a delete request because we only use that extra thing for delete request. So if we have extra, if that's not null, then it's a delete request. And to make sure that this gets cleared for every new request, I'll go to my custom hook and actually set extra to null here when we send the request, but instead store it on the response. There I'll set extra to action extra, and that means that further down in our custom hook, we no longer append the extra when we send the request. So I'll get rid of this here. Instead, we append the extra once the response is there. So a tiny tweak here so that in ingredients.js we know if we have an extra, then we're deleting. Else, in our case, thus far, we're adding. So here I can dispatch, well, basically what we did before. So let me scroll down. Can dispatch this here. So let's copy that and use it here. Remove all the comments. Now, of course, here I'm relying on some data from the response. The good thing is we're getting that data. So that should be data.name because we're storing whatever response data we're getting in our custom hook. We're storing that. We're sending this here along with our action, and that gets stored in our state there. So we store response data in data. So the good thing is we have access to this. But for the ingredient, which we also want, we're missing that. Now we could send this along as a request extra, of course. But then this check here wouldn't work. Still, let's use request extra here and then worry about this in a second step. So request extra should be the ingredient which gets added. So an add ingredient handler where we get that ingredient, which just misses the ID. I now will forward that ingredient as an extra. But now since we have extras for both deleting and for adding, we need a different way of differentiating these two effects we're handling, the two results we're getting back from our hook. And therefore in the hook, I'll add a new field, the last one, here to my state, to the initial state. That's the identifier. Initially, it's null. But we send this, when we dispatch the send request, let's say, then we set identifier equal to, and I expect to get an identifier as an argument, a request identifier maybe. So I'll set this here, I pass this to the action, and in the reducer, when we send this, I'll set identifier here equal to action.identifier. So now we can append an identifier to every HTTP request in the end. That's just what I'll do in ingredients.js when we dispatch, when we send the request here for adding an ingredient. I'll name this add ingredient. The identifier here is totally up to you. You can use any identifier you want. Can be a string, can be a number. I'll use add ingredient as a string. For removing an ingredient, I'll use an identifier of remove ingredient. And now we can use these identifiers in our effect to clearly identify our logic. So let's get the identifier from use HTTP. Let's make sure we return it there. So in our custom hook at the bottom, where we return everything, there we should also return the request identifier from HTTP state identifier. Now, since we're returning it here in the custom hook, we can pull it out of the return value here in ingredients.js, request identifier like this. And now with it pulled out, we can add it as a dependency to use effect. And then here check if request identifier is equal to, what did I use? Remove ingredient. That's my identifier here for deleting. And for adding, I used add ingredient. So here I'll check else if request identifier is equal to add ingredient. Otherwise, we'll not do anything. So this should now be all. And I know it was a lot that we need to also add ingredients. So let's log in here. And let's add a couple of apples here. And I get an error. Can I read property name of null in ingredients.js line 43? Do you have any idea what could be causing that? Well, it happened pretty fast if you saw that. So the problem is that useEffect runs after every render cycle. And when does this component re-render? Well, it re-renders, for example, when our custom hook here does something, when it dispatches the send action, which actually sets loading to true. That causes ingredients.js to re-render because we're using loading in there. Makes sense, right? Now, since that is the case, we want to make sure that we don't just check the identifier here before we dispatch actions, but we also check whether we're done with loading. Because if we're loading, then we might have data, but we're not done loading yet. Yes, data will only be set if a response is there in our custom hook here. But when we dispatch the first action, we also see data for the first time. So just watching for data changes alone here won't do the trick, especially since request extra and request identifier also might have changed, and hence the effect will rerun. So here we need a more granular check. We can check if we're not loading anymore. And of course, that means that we now need to add isLoading as a dependency here to useEffect. And we have that identifier here. And down here for adding, it's the same. We're checking for not loading, and the identifier is add ingredient. In addition, I also want to ensure here that we got data, so that this is not null, or that we have no error. That's the better check, probably. So we should also add error here. It's also a check that makes sense for deleting. I want to ensure that we have no error here. So now let's save this, log in, and let's add some bananas here. And this looks good. This looks way better. They're getting added. We can see them here too. And this works. And now if I delete, let's say, the apples, this also is looking pretty decent to me. It now works with the help of our custom hook.